All right, hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this installment of the NACBS book series. I'm Amanda Perry, I'm the Executive Director for the NACBS, and I am just going to briefly introduce our guests today and then turn it over to them to get started. So today we are joined by Darren Reid, who is currently a Banting postdoctoral fellow at the University of Alberta. His articles on British imperialism have appeared in the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History, the Journal of British Studies, the Journal of Canadian Studies, Australian Historical Studies, South African Historical Studies, South African Historical Journal, apologies, and more. Darren's interests also span the digital humanities and public history. He developed his own historical video game in 2022, published an article about the historical video game development in the Public Historian, and he is currently pursuing a new book project on the intersection of natural history museums and Canadian environmental colonialism. So thanks for joining us today, Darren. And he's going to be joined in conversation by Alan Lester, who is Professor of Historical Geography at the University of Sussex, and the author most recently of Ruling the World, Freedom, Civilization, and Liberalism in the 19th Century British Empire, and Deny and Disavow, Distancing the Imperial Past in the Culture War. He is the editor of The Truth About Empire, Real Histories of British Colonialism, and he is also co-editor of the Manchester University Press Studies in Imperialism series. So I hope you all join me in welcoming Darren and Alan, and I'll turn it over to them.
Thank you very much for organising this, Amanda. And it's my real pleasure to be able to talk to Darren about his new book. I'm just going to give a brief introduction and then we'll engage in a question and answer session, a kind of conversation really, Darren and myself, for about 20 minutes. And then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And if you want to be thinking about questions you want to ask, you can either put them in the chat, or when the time comes, I'll have a look at whose hands are up on the screen. So yeah, just to introduce Darren's book, I'm introducing it in my capacity as co-editor of the series in which it's published, Manchester University Press's Studies in Imperialism series, which is getting on for its 200th volume now, one of the longest established monograph series in colonial and imperial studies, and with a very strong tradition of studies of the political and cultural formation of the British Empire, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and especially in the settler colonies, which is the context in which Darren's book is placed. So Darren's written about the cleavage between the self-governing settler states and the administrative authority of the British Empire, administered by various governmental offices in London. And that split is usually told as a tale of settler political mobilisation, white Anglo-Saxon settler political mobilisation following the Canadian precedent after the rebellions of 1837 to 8 and the Durham Report. But Darren emphasises that settler nationhood and imperial citizenship were by no means opposed necessarily. So he shifts the focus onto a relationship between an emerging conception of settler nationhood and a persistent idea of imperial citizenship, teasing out the relationship between the two and also broadening the cast of characters involved in negotiating that relationship well beyond white Anglophone settlers. So he shows how Indigenous peoples, as well as settlers, adapted, resisted and gave shape to the changes in sovereignty and jurisdiction that were happening around them. And he moves back and forth in case studies within each of the major settler colonies, Canada, South Africa, Australia and New Zealand. So I'll now stop talking about Darren's book on his behalf and give Darren himself a chance to say something about it. So first question for you, Darren. Could you take us briefly through the outline of your main argument for each of the settler colonies stroke nations in turn, please?
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming to this so far, and for those who are going to be here soon, I look forward to seeing that. So the main argument, very briefly, for the book as a whole throughout its chapters, is that the language of Indigenous rights and humanitarianism, imperial humanitarianism, provided a malleable framework for people living throughout the colonies. And that's a very vague phrase I use throughout the book, people living in the colonies. because I'm including lots of different people. So I'm including settlers, I'm including indigenous peoples, I'm including missionaries who are both settlers and sometimes indigenous peoples, and people of all sorts of backgrounds. I argue that the language of Indigenous rights offered a framework for making demands, a large array of demands on the British government to do things for individual people. So it indicates this ongoing relationship between individual people living in settler colonies and the idea of British authority. And so that's why the book's called Invoking Empire, because I look at how people try to use the language of Indigenous rights to invoke the power of the empire for their own, essentially often personal benefit, but often societal benefit as well. So I do that in a wide variety of ways, and I'll just skip quickly through some of the colonies. Like, for example, one chapter on British Columbia in the 1860s looks at how the BC government's botched handling of smallpox epidemics in Indigenous communities in BC was used to demand that Britain provide responsible government for British Columbia, because they could make a responsible government could be more humanitarian than the British government's botched handling of smallpox was. In Natal in the 1870s, I look at how the Natal governments, so these BC and Natal government at the time were representative governments, so they're like essentially controlled through the colonial office by governors, although they have representative institutions. In Natal's case, settlers saying that the governor's handling of alleged polygamy amongst Zulu society was a reason why responsible government was necessary in Natal, because responsible government in Natal could more effectively civilize and prevent polygamy in Zulu society. Moving over to Western Australia, again in the 1880s, at this time, a representative government. The failure of Western Australia's government to suppress slavery, the enslavement of Indigenous peoples, was used as justification, more specifically for the British government's help in settling legal disputes that various people had become engaged in relative to the forced labor system that was prevalent in northern Western Australia at this time. That's connected to responsible government, but in more of an indirect way. It's more about people who lost a lot of money because of various involvements with the forced labor system, wanting help and using Indigenous rights language to demand that help, that legal help. Moving over to New Zealand, I have a couple chapters on New Zealand, one in the 1860s, one in the 1880s. Both of those cases looking at how the language of Indigenous rights was used to criticize the New Zealand government's handling of, in one hand, the Taranaki Wars in the 1860s, and on the other hand, the New Zealand government's failure to adhere to Treaty of Waitangi articles. So using the New Zealand government's failure to sufficiently be humanitarian to actually demand restrictions on the responsible government in New Zealand. So the complete opposite of the three previous cases where Indigenous rights is used to demand responsible government, this is being used to try to limit that responsible government. Similar thing happens in my chapter in Quebec in the 1870s. So Quebec, a part of a responsible government's colony of the Dominion of Canada, the failures of the Quebec government, and specifically the Quebec Catholic hierarchy to be sufficiently humanitarian towards Mohawk nations in Quebec, was used to try to limit Quebec's sovereignty, to demand the British government protect white Protestant rights in Quebec on behalf of these Indigenous peoples, but usually for white people. Moving over to Cape Colony, I again have a couple of different chapters, both in the 1880s, looking at how the language of Indigenous rights was used to criticize the Cape Colony government, which at that time was responsible government, in order to limit its power to in one chapter, legislate franchise requirements for Black South Africans, but in another limits the responsible government's power to sign treaties with people in Bechuana land. in the 1884-1885 Bechuanaland wars that were going on at that time. So in all these different case studies, in different decades, in different colonies, there's this connecting through line of different types of people using very similar Indigenous rights rhetoric to make a wide array of demands, some supporting responsible government, some challenging it, some actually trying to improve things for Indigenous or for colonized peoples, some having nothing to do with improving things for Indigenous or colonized peoples, but all of them indicating this ongoing personal relationship with imperial authority. So that's the overall argument of the book.
Oh, that's great, Darren. Thank you. And I think you've outlined really nicely one of the things that I found most innovative about your book. It challenges what I see as a kind of conventional narrative about settler self-government, which is that it was settlers demanding the right to govern themselves so that they could do what they wanted with their own so-called native policies or Indigenous policies, and a rather reluctant metropole, colonial office in London, fearing that ceding that kind of authority to settler legislatures would be abandoning their humanitarian commitment in the wake of slavery and the abolition of slavery to Indigenous peoples. And I think what you've demonstrated there in that very quick run through is that Indigenous rights could be used as arguments both for self-government and against self-government. And indeed that those arguments were made not just in this sort of relationship between settlers and the imperial authorities in London, but also with a variety of other peoples, Quebecois, Indigenous peoples, throwing their voices in. And again, on both sides of that question, both for and against, depending on the circumstances in each particular colony. So that's great. I think you've given us a really good outline of the major innovation, I think, of your work, its major contribution to the literature. Just to delve in a little bit more, though, to some of the sort of sub-arguments, if you like. I'm interested in the way you structured the book. So you go through case studies first from colonies without self-government and then from colonies with self-government. And then you look at Indigenous articulations of imperial citizenship, this idea that Indigenous peoples can still make claims on imperial citizenship, regardless of the state of self-governance in those colonies. Can you tell us why you structured the book in that way?
Yeah, that was not the original structure for the book. My original structure for the book was sort of influenced by a little bit of my background in communication studies, where I wanted the book to be about the different utilitarian sort of functional ways that people invoked imperial authority. So there's a section on petitions, there's a section on the press and the fourth estate and the idea of working through letters to the editor. And there's a section on bodily mobility of people moving from the colonies, traveling to London and to invoke power in person. And what I found was it didn't make any sense if you tried to read the book from beginning to end, because it was just all sorts of different colonies thrown together, different timelines. It didn't make any linear sense. And I started to notice that grouping them in terms of the political context of the places they were writing from, you start to see connections between them. So if I abandoned my functionalist approach and I looked at, okay, let's just look at colonies that don't yet have responsible government, all of a sudden I notice these are all about demanding responsible government, which that's essentially aligns with a lot of the literature on, say, colonial petitioning in the British Empire, that it tends to see that, well, petitions from the colonies up until a colony receives responsible government, they all tend to be demanding responsible government. So it kind of supports the scholarship that way, although that scholarship essentially says that once responsible government appears, no more petitions appear except from Indigenous peoples, which is a big tendency I challenge in the second two parts of the book. But yes, that's why I started to see these sections. So all the three chapters in the first part about pre-responsible government, they're all connected to demanding responsible government for various reasons, all saying that responsible government would be more humanitarian for three different reasons. The second section about the chapters on colonies with responsible government, specifically, so this is section 2 from settlers. They also have this shared connection in that they essentially abandon formal petitions. except for one of the chapters, not so much. But instead, what I see is the first chapter or the first part about cases from non-responsible governments is they're using formal petitions. They're writing to the Colonial Office, they're petitioning House of Commons in Britain, they're working through the Secretary of State for the Colonies. The second part, they're working through newspapers primarily, largely because many of them accept that petitions are no longer feasible because of responsible government. Petitions aren't really going to work anymore because you can petition the Colonial Office, it's just going to send it right back and say you have to work locally. And so in recognition of that, a lot of these chapters are now writing letters to the editor of the Times and the Standard and Pall Mall Gazette, trying to use public opinion in Britain to indirectly influence affairs in their colonies. So that's what a lot of the chapters in that part are about. And then the third section on Indigenous performances of imperial citizenship, again, are recognizing that those happen for often similar reasons of land rights are being dismissed or being completely ignored. I think there's all three, and voting rights. So there are both voting rights and land rights being transgressed and using imperial authority to demand those be recognized, which again, it aligns with literature of the very extensive literature on Indigenous petitions. But what that part does differently than the extensive literature on Indigenous petitions is look at all the things that happen around petitions. So of looking at one chapter is about interference by settler government officials, which I term disinformation, which is again pulling from a little bit of my communication studies background. One is looking at how humanitarians try to manipulate Indigenous petitions in various ways. So that's essentially why the structure came about, is that I have an overarching argument about the interconnectedness of all these things, but I also recognize that each one has its particular differences. And that made a lot more sense than my functionist approach.
Thanks, Dale. Yeah, that certainly does make sense. I think since we're pressing on for the sort of 20-minute slot for us to talk, I'm going to just ask you one more question before we open up to Q&As. And that really is about these Indigenous articulations of belonging within empire and of a claim to citizenship from Indigenous peoples. And I guess particularly, my background is more in the Australian side of this. There's an ongoing debate about the extent to which those claims were heartfelt because people felt that they should and did belong within an imperial frame, and how much they were strategic. They were simply, trying to preserve as much land and as much sovereignty, as much autonomy as they could, and this was the means of doing so. What's your sense on that with your sort of broader imperial scope?
Yeah, I'm very glad you asked that question, because that's a major argument in my book, is challenging that need to say, oh, is it heartfelt and strategic? I mean, first of all, historians can't know that. I mean, I can't know if you are heartfelt about anything you're saying because it's in your interior mind. Historians, we cannot answer that question, I don't think, in any terms. So I don't think it's really useful to ask that question. No, you asked me that question. For other people to ask that question, were they heartfelt? We don't know. Second of all, can it be both? You can be both heartfelt about something and use it strategically. So that's this binary is a little strange. But second, what I argue about against and push back against is in the literature on Indigenous imperial citizenship, it's all based on this idea, which is true, that imperial citizenship was never codified. There was no such thing as an imperial citizen. It was a set of ideas. And because of that, it always had to be invoked rhetorically. So you had to say, well, I deserve rights as an imperial citizen because I am, for example, educated according to Western education, or because I have been loyal in various warfares. The loyalist approach is very common. But Sukanya Banerjee's book throws in a whole bunch of rhetorical ways that it could be invoked of creditworthiness, of cleanliness, of using all these different types of rhetoric to claim rights because there are no codified rights of imperial citizenship. And I challenge that because in my 3 chapters on Indigenous people's petitions and various performances of imperial citizenship, they're not based on rhetoric, they're based on constitutional law for various reasons. For example, my chapter on the Cape Colony in the 1880s, which looks at Black South Africans demanding protections of their voting rights because the Cape Colony government was trying to take voting rights away from Black South Africans. They weren't asking the British government to block that legislation because they were loyal or because they were civilized or any of these reasons. They were doing it because they had an established constitutional right from the 1853 Cape Colony Constitution, which explicitly explicitly allowed for Black South Africans to vote. So they were not making a demand of imperial citizenship rights based on loyalty or connection or belonging. They were using constitutional law. And the same thing happens in New Zealand in the 1880s. When I look at the various Maori petitions that get sent to London in the 1880s, those petitions were not based on loyalism or belonging or civilization or anything. Some of that rhetoric is in the petitions, but the rhetoric is based on the constitutional right that the British government had to interfere in Maori affairs, specifically Section 71 of the New Zealand Constitution. And the Treaty of Waitangi are legal treaty relationships. So I kind of challenge this idea that just because imperial citizenship wasn't codified, that it didn't exist and that it had no legal connections. People made legal connections, and that's how important it was to people throughout the colony. So that's why I'm very happy for that question, because that's one of my main arguments.
Well, you answered it very well, and I'm glad I set it up for you guys. Well, I think what we'll do is open it up to any questions from those who are online. I've just opened the chat. There's nothing there yet. If you want to write a question in the chat or a comment for discussion, please do that. Otherwise, if you could put your cameras on, and I will see if I can see any raised hands. And we've got one straight away. Dane, it's good to see you.
Yes.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Good to see you too. So thank you for participating in this, and Darren, thank you for giving us some sense of your book. I'm still trying to get my head around it because there are so many variables, it sounds like, that are at interplay in this story. I mean, there's a common variable. I guess it's the interaction between different groups within these colonies and the metropolitan imperial government, right? What I'm trying to figure out, so your different colonial groups, some of them are settlers, some of them are humanitarians, some of them are indigenous peoples. Now, do they collaborate in some of these operations? Do they play upon, I mean, you know, in the American context, sometimes settlers sort of embrace the claims of indigeneity as a way of enforcing their rights to land. And I'm sort of curious, you're talking about these as indigenous rights claims. Are there settlers making those claims? And are they making them basically as a way of claiming indigeneity, or are they doing it in alliance with indigenous peoples? So I'm trying to, if you could sort of clarify that. One other very quick question is, since this is the late 19th century, where do immigrants of color play into this story?
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for those questions and for attending.
You will be seen now.
And okay.
Oh. Okay, someone was unmuted. So I will answer that question. Is someone trying to talk?
No, you're all right. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So first question. When I talk about settlers making indigenous rights claims, it's not in the sense that you referenced of settlers claiming indigeneity, which is something that I don't really come across in my case studies. So that's not really what it's about. Instead, it's about the second option you mentioned of settlers making indigenous right claims, positioning themselves as if they are allies or supporters of people around them. So oftentimes the main commonality that touches every single chapter is everyone had some connection to the Aborigines Protection Society in London. So most of the case studies I talk about of settlers, of missionaries, of all these people in the colonies, almost all of them were correspondents or informants for the Aborigines Protection Society. If not, then they often established their own copies of that, such as the American Indigenous Rights Association, such as in Australia, the Association for the Protection of Native Races. So all these types of local copycats of the British Aborigines Protection Society, that's what brings all these people together. Whether or not they actually intended, this gets back to the heartfelt issue of whether they actually intended to goodwill towards the people they claim to be speaking on the behalf of. It's impossible to say, but I do argue throughout the book that these settlers who are using this rhetoric of Indigenous rights, supposedly on the behalf of local Indigenous peoples, it always had economic or political incentives for them to do so. Whether that be in the case of Western Australia, we have a variety of a couple missionaries, a couple settlers who were just day laborers. We have a couple military soldiers and administrators using this rhetoric of Indigenous rights to protect forced Indigenous peoples who have been indoctrinated, not indoctrinated. I'm trying to avoid language of they have been enslaved because I've been challenged on that in various ways, but they have been inculcated into a forced labor system. Oftentimes, those settlers making those demands have a lot of economic gain if the demands they're making are met. And that goes throughout all the chapters. So it is about settlers supposedly being allies, but oftentimes the intention is very dubious. Okay, so that's the first question. And then the second question, I'm trying to get what was the second question?
Immigrants of color. And do they
immigrants of color?
Do they play any role in this story, given the time period we're talking about, and that these are white settler colonies?
Yeah, not so much in these specific case studies. Not in that they're irrelevant. I mean, specifically, the British Columbia case is the 1860s, so that's kind of before influx of Asian immigrants. And Australia, the case of Western Australia in 1880s, certainly fear of Asian immigration is playing a part in some of these discussions. But my primary sources that I rely most upon are letters written to the Aborigines Protection Society, petitions sent to the Colonial Office, letters to the editor published in the Times Standard, never mention immigrants of color in the cases I look at. So I haven't seen it pop up, but it's certainly important. It's just not in an explicit way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Did I see? Yeah.
Yes, please go ahead.
I was asking was there another question?
Martin Weiner is trying to talk, but you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Martin, you're on mute. If you could unmute yourself and start again.
No.
Sorry, Martin, you're still muted. You could write in the chat box if you want. Still on mute, I'm afraid. We'll see if Martin can turn the mute off. Otherwise, I will ask another question.
I think it would. Okay. Is this better?
Yes.
I'm sorry. I don't have my computer, and I am using my wife, Meredith Skeur's computer. But I do want to say that I enjoyed very much your talk about your book and summary of the book. And I agree with you. I think it's very persuasive. I agree with you, particularly about the difficulty sometimes of neatly separating, you might say, self-interested use of Indigenous rights rhetoric from some actual sincerity. It's easy just to be cynical and say it's all a front. But I think that you need some evidence before you do that. So that's all. And
Yeah.
I just want to compliment you on your. I have not read the book, but on how you've summarized it.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a challenge I've dealt with in this topic for sure. Is I always you come at it with a critical lens, saying, "Oh, this is clearly untrue." I know settlers. We've constructed settlers as a category, and we know settlers are bad, and anything they do that seems good is probably bad. Much like corporations, we construct these things, and on the individual, we have to consider like what is structural, what is individual. Can there be good people if they have good intentions? How do those good intentions apply to structural difficulties?
Yes.
And yeah, all these sorts of disaggregating individual intent, structural implication. And my sort of approach to that, I mean, I have various approaches. One is the structural approach is I don't really care what their intention is. Like they could have good intentions, they could have bad intentions. What is the structural impact of this
Yes.
on a societal level?
Sure.
But my other approach is not bad to have a financial incentive. This is sort of my approach, garnered from Christopher Brown's book, Moral Capital, where he approaches the anti-slavery movement in Britain and says that, yeah, there's all sorts of these ideas of slavery being bad, but people had ideas of slavery being bad for centuries. They didn't do anything about it until there's a financial incentive in some way, or a political incentive, and that's just human behavior. We can not like something, but how many people are going to take a stance about something if there's zero incentive? So just because people have an incentive, it doesn't mean they're demons. It just means you have to think about like how is it attached to societal structural issues.
Yes.
So that's my sort of approach.
Thanks, Darren.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Just one more question from me about you've said that a variety of different interest groups joined in this conversation about self-governance and pushed for self-governance, and an equally complex array of people pushed against it. But one of the sort of structuring arguments that I saw through the book is that ultimately you conclude that the result of these discussions, the sort of net outcome of these discussions, was that imperial citizenship as a lived reality became unviable. It was no longer a reality to which people could appeal. And clearly that's the case in the light of history. But maybe you could say a little bit more about how that notion of imperial citizenship as a valid and meaningful entity started to decline through these discussions.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a question I really had to grapple with throughout the research for this project. And I framed it in my head as, what is the historical significance of failed initiatives? Because every single case study I examine, they never work out. They always fail. Invoking imperial authority in the ways that the people do in my book, they never get what they want. And so I had to think about what is the historical significance of a large swath of people doing things that all ultimately fail on individual levels. And the argument I make is that through the process of demanding that the British government help various people in their various local campaigns or various local situations, those demands created public ripples that other people could see, and that those created disincentives for doing it again. So for example, nearly all of the settlers examples that I examine who make demands for British intervention in settler affairs, if they did it publicly, there's a huge public backlash. And so through that process of trying to demand imperial citizenship, creating this backlash that reinforces the idea that any future people who do this will be reprimanded. So in terms of what this backlash looks like, People are boycotted for, like, no local shop will sell food to somebody who demands that British government interferes in local affairs. Some people are beaten and like physically abused for becoming traitors to the settler society. Some people are withheld from promotion, and so there's all sorts of negative impacts, very public negative impacts, that every time someone tries to demand British intervention or invoke imperial authority, it creates yet another data point of everyone saying, okay, we should stop doing that. So that's one sense, that every time you demand this, it's a vicious cycle, disincentivizing doing that again. But another way that I think making these demands for imperial citizenship actively worked to disincentivize it, or not to disincentivize it, worked to structurally and legally make it less effective, was specifically when Indigenous peoples tried to demand British assistance in various ways. They were turning a vague idea into a solid idea. So for example, before there's 3 Maori petitions between 1882 to 1884 to the British government. Before those petitions took place, there was a vague idea that the British government would or could protect Maori rights if they asked for it. It was this vague idea that, oh yeah, they probably could. But when they demanded that they did it, the British government had to make a tough choice and had to say, are we or are we not going to? And they repeatedly said, we are not going to. So in the process of making a demand, they turned this vague hope that something would be done into a solid nothing will be done. We now have evidence, we have precedent, nothing will be done. So that itself makes it less viable to continue doing this. So I think that's sort of the way that continually making demands on this vague concept led to that concept no longer being vague and being very solid and being negatively solid. So that's one of the other arguments of the historical significance of failed endeavors, is you're creating precedent for future endeavors to never take place in the first place.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much, Darren. Well, I think we're probably up for about time now, unless there's any final questions from anybody. If you want to raise your hand on the Zoom, otherwise, no, I'll hand over back to Amanda then, with great thanks to you, Darren, and for everybody for coming along, joining in.
Thanks so much, Alan, and thank you, Darren. It's been great to hear more about your work, and I appreciate you taking the time. So I just want to briefly thank everyone for coming. We have a full series of these book events. You can check our website for other events, and we hope to see you all at some of those. But in the meantime, I hope everyone will join me in thanking Darren and Alan for this wonderful talk.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Amanda, for organizing it. And thank you very much, Alan, for being willing to moderate it. Thanks so much.
Of course. Thanks to both of you.